Chris Durt, he studies philosophy, psychology, and computational linguistics in Heidelberg, Taxon, and has masters from the Munich University, and also did PhD studies at University of California, Berkeley, and Santa Cruz. Subsequently, he worked as a guest lecturer at Berkeley and then research assistant and principal investigator in several projects on AI, the self, consciousness in Heidelberg, Vienna, and Freiburg, and led a couple of grants recently within the EU Horizons program and the German DFG and Volkswagen Foundation. And now, Chris, if I follow you correctly, you are based in Technical University of Munich, right?
Correct, yes, thank you.
So over to you, Chris. LLMs and the patterns of human language use. We have half an hour for the first talk, half an hour for the second, so the session is going to be about an hour long, and then we have 15 minutes for Q&A. But you may, if you want to have more space for questions and directly to you, you may squeeze it to 25 if you prefer, or 20. That's fine as well. But no more than 30 minutes, please. I'm going to chair the session from here. So over to you, Chris.
Yes, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Marcin. I'm very happy to be here, and I think this is a really interesting workshop because bringing in phenomenology into this topic is something I deem to be very important. It has been a little neglected in the discussion of artificial intelligence. I started doing artificial intelligence and looking into that. That's already many years ago. And then came to phenomenology because I realized that phenomenology is a really great method and tradition to look into problems of artificial intelligence. And that's not because I think that artificial intelligence would be something that would develop a kind of phenomenology where artificial intelligence is like an intelligence in a real sense, where it develops a mind and has a phenomenal experience, but because phenomenology is able to pick up a lot of issues and contribute a lot of insights to issues raised by artificial intelligence. And that is, I think artificial intelligence is not a kind of new intelligence in the literal sense, or a new mind, a new kind of being that we have, but it is operating with meaning or patterns, I will argue more precisely, that in humans change meaningful relations. That means we understand the output of AI as something, as an intelligent answer, for instance, to prompts, or to something that can change our experience in meaningful ways. And that allows AI to enter a new realm, so to say, of the human mind without having experienced itself, nevertheless changing human experience. And this notion of experience is something that has been excluded from the discussions of AI. As Marcin mentioned, there is a rather difficult relation between phenomenology and AI studies. And I think this is really something that needs to be overcome, because experience is really important for what AI is doing, because it changes our experience. And this is something I want to look in today. So my talk is a little rather explorative and maybe a little visionary too, because I think according to what I read about this workshop, it is supposed to be something more exploratory, where we look into options, what phenomenology can contribute to the topic of artificial intelligence, and in particular large language models, and how they change the human mind, and especially in relation to psychiatric issues. So my title is Large Language Models and the Patterns of Human Language Use. This goes back to a publication, a paper Thomas Fuchs and I wrote. It was published very recently in Okay, now the clicker doesn't work. In this book, Phenomenologies of the Digital Age, and this is something I want to build on and explore a little bit further. You can access that paper online on my website. Just download it from there. And yeah, this is something to build on, but I'm not restricting myself to what we wrote there. What I rather want to argue is that there are different kinds of patterns involved. So patterns of human language use are kind of central here because they stand between the stochastic patterns, which large language models make use of, and experiential patterns that are important for human language understanding. But of course, like I could have called this talk also large language models and experiential patterns, for instance, just to have that reference to the to that paper and to other work I did. I chose that title. So let's look first into what are the stochastic patterns that large language models work, and then come to the other kinds of patterns. I try to make this rather fast so we have a little time for discussion. This is a workshop I co-organized last summer on large language models. I chose this title or the poster of the workshop because you see the different patterns here that are the patterns that large language models like ChatGPT work with. That means when they have a text like this title, large language models and the patterns of human language use, they cut this into parts, so-called tokens, right? So one token is capital L, and another one is capital M, small s, and so on. So you have these different tokens which are then processed by the machine. So this is the first step of what a large language model basically does when you enter a prompt. Analyze this into different tokens. Now, for instance, the token pattern is not just one token, but you can see here there's a patterns with an S, then there's a patterns with an S, so the plural with an empty space before that. Then you have the capital patterns, then you have the URL patterns, and they have the same with the empty space before, with an underscore. So these are the different ways to write patterns in plural in the token language, so to say, or better to say, token alphabet of large language models. Basically, the tokens are the alphabet, the smallest units large language models work with. And these are the starting point. And you can see, I don't know why a capital L twice is like one token. It's automated processing, of course, that led to those tokens too. There are several methods to do that. The capital M, small s is probably there because miss or misses in English language is used frequently. And of course, those tokens usually they correspond to what humans conceive like as words because those are just the things that are used most in a language. But for the model, it doesn't really matter what the meaning of those is. They're just concerned with like the frequency of their appearance, basically. So for the model, those tokens are numbers. You see that behind here, there were those small numbers. The numbers correspond to the title in the way it is given to a large language model. So here you have just a couple of numbers following each other. And that is what the large language model gets from that text, which is might be a prompt, for instance. So what happens with those tokens next, if you look into that? So the transformer architecture, that is the modern architecture that has been around since about 2017, which replaced like the recurrent neural networks before. And it is built in this way that the tokens are turned into vectors. And that basically is the space of relations between tokens that has been determined in the development of the model. So by feeding the model incredibly large amounts of text, like the whole internet, everything basically people could get their hand off in digital form would be used to train the model. The model would predict future tokens and check whether the weights given in the model would lead to the output corresponding to the token that was expected, which would be hidden to the model. That's like the most popular way to train those models. So from this large training set, all those vectors were extracted, so to say. The tokens are transformed into these vectors. They're as a word embedding table. They are using to transform the tokens into vectors. And then from that general input, so to say, we need to still get to the kind of context. People talk about context here, but of course it's like just a statistical context, which means like whatever is put into the context window, so-called context window, which is basically the prompt and it's cut to a certain amount depending on the model. So you have these tokens which are then put into the vector, and some of them are amplified and some of them are diminished in that process, and thereby the input, the prompt becomes determinate for the continuance of the patterns in that for the stochastic patterns from the input, and produce an output that is a good continuation of that input, and depending on additional training is either an answer to the input, or it could even like recognize something from the prompt, or continue the prompt, or whatever kind of task you give to the model. This is basically the idea of, or what is happening in the model. They're just numbers, and these are related to other numbers. And in the end, there's an output of numbers, which is then again translated into tokens. And those tokens are translated into or put into what we then receive as an output. There is no understanding in any human-like sense in there. And I think asking for understanding within that model doesn't really get us to what happens. Because what happens is that these stochastic patterns the model work with correspond to patterns of human language use. That is, not to all patterns of human language use, right? Language use can comprise a lot of things: gesticulation, intonation, a lot of other things. Large language models as we have them today basically only work with text, that is, text taken from a digital form. And that already is a big reduction of human language use. But also, of course, human language use is not there in itself just speaking in a continuance, but in a wider context where experience also has a part. So let's look into the patterns of human language use before we then come to experiential patterns. Now, there's different theories about how to think of meaning, because here questions of meaning and understanding are raised. So the most popular conception of meaning, I think, in philosophy, which is also applied in some thought on large language models, for instance, to argue against the possibilities that large language models can understand. That most common form of meaning, of thinking about meaning, is the representational theory of meaning. And there the idea is the symbols we have in a language, say the words, they represent something, but they don't represent the word directly, rather they represent meaning. Meaning, of course, a big philosophical question, what exactly is meaning? But meaning is thought to be something in between symbols and the word that mediates the relation to the word. And the idea of people like Bender and Kohler is that the symbols by themselves, they don't lead to an understanding if they're not grounded somehow in the word. And only then there is something we can say that there is an understanding of meaning. And since large language models are not grounded in the word, they claim they don't have understanding. Now, I think it's true. Large language models don't understand in any human-like sense or comparable sense. But the representational theory of meaning is something I would, from a phenomenological perspective, question. So I think that sometimes representation can have to do with meaning, of course. But I think what we are concerned with in the case of large language models is not just language per se. Large language models don't model language just as language. That was symbolic AI, where we try to model the rules of language, the grammar, and some semantical relations, and thereby come to a form of so-called understanding of the world. But this is not what large language models are doing. Large language models extract those stochastic patterns from a large text corpus. And that text corpus is not just language per se, but is language used in certain contexts, right? Language we gather from the internet on some website is meant to do something. People read it, for instance, to extract some information. So there's a use already, and large language models predict that use in the text corpus. So they're not just working with meaning, they work with not just with language, but with language use. And here I think the use theory of meaning comes in handy. So this is something usually attributed to Wittgenstein, but I think it's not just Wittgenstein who thinks in this way, but also phenomenology in some important sense. So the idea of the use theory of meaning is that if we think of the symbols, they are merely parts of a process of sense making. We can say they scaffold human sense making. That is, they're used to communicate, for instance, or to think. Symbols help us to remember things. So these are things that help us doing things we could do possibly without symbols to a certain extent. But words, if we think of words here, words are there to help us in sense making, in communicative interactions, in things we're doing already. And these are all interwoven in the word. So there is already something going on basically where language helps us doing things in more precise things and ways, and maybe even do things better, and maybe even do new things that we wouldn't be able to do without language. This is not just because language can represent things, but because language as usage of words is involved in sense-making processes. So if you think of just this connection between symbols, sense-making, and word, what does phenomenology have to do with that? Well, I think everything. So basically, phenomenology describes or is an important description of that whole interaction, the interplay between symbols, sense making, and word. Phenomenology since Edmund Husserl, who also as a mathematician was interested in symbols and their relations and sense making of how these relate to the world and how they're used in the live world to interact with each other. Henri Husserl conceived of phenomenology as something that also comprises all of these things. So I do think that we can apply phenomenology to this whole idea of language use and to discover in a better way how that relates to experience. So let's go to experiential patterns. Experiential patterns, of course, have been investigated in psychology and philosophy for a long time. Think of Gestalt psychology, for instance, where patterns in perception are important. And I think these are also important for language. I here want to concentrate, though, on this idea of scaffolding. So if we think of scaffolding, a scaffold used for construction in relation to large language models, then what this large language model here gets from the text input, the prompt, and the text it was trained with is basically only the scaffolds of what humans use when they make sense with language, right? They get the tokens even from the text that was used in the context of understanding. And these tokens then are processed in the models to produce, again, text, which would be like the answer, for instance, to a question. But that text would not be just a meaningful text for the large language model, but merely a scaffold, which we can then use to understand again. This idea has been put forward, or similar ideas have been put forward in phenomenology, and I would just like to point out two instances of how to apply phenomenology to large language models. And this is by Susan Stewart. She claims that cultural language, which is the language we are thinking of when we use words, basically relies on a natural language that is already there in the communication between beings, whether they have words or not. And this goes back to Thomas Reid, of course. And for natural language, and by implication then also cultural language, a phenomenological background is needed to exchange. The co-constitution of meaning happens, co-creation of meaning happens in a shared world where there is an interaction between conscious beings or beings who are aware of each other and in relation to the world. And she argues that because large language models miss that background, they cannot become conscious or understand. And then language, she says, is a big deceiver because it makes it look as if there was understanding, intention, and consciousness where there is none. So large language models produce that. We bring in the missing experience and understanding when we read the text of a large language model. And that makes it easily appear as if there was something going on in a large language model. We are used to communicate with other humans which are understandingly relating to us, at least sometimes, and infer from that to large language models that there must be something in the large language models where, in fact, all they produce is numbers, basically. Another instance I would quickly like to point out is Thomas Fuchs, who also wrote that paper. And we drew on a previous idea he published on language production in relatively free speech. He compares the speech to the potential cone in Edmund Husserl. That is, from the now, there is a cone of things that might come in the future, and some in the close future are more probable than others. So the improbable events are at the borders, and the most probable events are in the middle. And it's a cone because the more we go into the future, the less we can anticipate what is going to come. Now, there is an anticipation here, not a prediction. Maybe you can use predictive models to somehow model the anticipation, but for humans, it's not really something like for machines where there is just a prediction of the next word or something, but there is anticipation of possible continuances, and there is a intertwinement between unconscious production of possible words and conscious awareness of that and guiding of those processes. So just to finish with two citations here, where Thomas Fuchs says the words unfold in the semblance themselves in the speech without conscious control, following our overarching interest and intention. There is something that the words do, so to say, by themselves without our conscious control, but they're following our overall interest and intention. We're doing something with words. There is a flow which we relate to, but which we also guide. So guiding this complex process that is spanning the intentional arc of the sentence, despite its initial indeterminacy, requires continuous attention because the unfolding of the meaning must not be disturbed by inappropriate associations, incursions, or peripheral perceptions. So there's some intertwinement of unconscious processes and a guiding through our awareness taking place. And in this middle field of anticipation and guidance of conscious awareness of our perception of the meaning in relation to our imagination and experience, that is where the experiential patterns come in. And I'm not saying that the stochastic patterns directly model experiential patterns. What they models are patterns of human language use. And in these patterns of human language use, so to say, when we read them, then we bring in experience, which means experience is actually not in the patterns of language use themselves or in the stochastic patterns used to model them, but we bring them in again. And this might be also why they're not really part of the language use in the narrow sense, in the use of words, because they're so self-evident, they don't turn up. We don't need to write them down again. And nevertheless, they're important for our understanding. Experience and this process of making sense is very important for understanding language. And forgetting it will not explain us what large language models can do. We need to look into the phenomenology of language use to understand better how stochastic patterns can then change our understanding of the world. So thank you very much for your attention. I would like to stop now so we have still 10 minutes for discussion.